One of my favorite treats to make during Chinese holidays is tangyun or tangyuan. Tangyun is the Cantonese word and tangyuan is Mandarin, and I'm probably saying both wrong because I'm bad at both. If you've never had a tangyuan before, it is kind of like a sweet dessert dumpling that's chewy on the outside and typically served in a ginger-based broth. There are actually savory tangyuan as well, served in different parts of China, but where my family's from, I only grew up with the sweet version. There are all kinds of fillings that you can find in tangyuan, even if you're just looking at the sweet kind, but probably the two most common are black sesame and peanut. Tangyuan in general are deceptively tricky to make. They require very few ingredients, so they're very simple on the ingredient front, but there is some technique involved and they can be a little frustrating if you don't know what to look for. So I think video is probably the best way to learn this if you don't have someone in your life that can show you hands-on, or if you can't come to one of our LA workshops. Sorry, my cat. Because there's some things that you can only get across, by showing it. I've also had quite a few videos go viral on TikTok and Instagram because I am a little bit extra and I like to make my tangyuan have like pretty designs, like little flowers and things like that. So I'll also be showing you a little bonus at the end of how you can make your tangyuan look pretty as well. So if you've always wanted to make tangyuan and you've never gotten around to it, or you've tried before and it didn't come out quite right, stick around. I'm going to show you how I make them. But first, make sure to like and subscribe if this type of content is interesting to you so I can keep making this type of content in the future. And we're going to start with a quick trip to the grocery store. All of the ingredients in tangyuan are relatively easy to find if you have a bigger Asian market in your area. And what's nice about tangyuan is you don't necessarily need to even have a Chinese market. These ingredients tend to kind of span across all of Asia. So you could probably get lucky if you're near a South Asian or Southeast Asian store as well. So the first thing that you'll want to look for is glutinous rice flour. You can find glutinous rice in an aisle with different types of starches like cornstarch and potato starch. And the main thing is that you want to make sure you don't mix it up with regular rice flour. Regular rice flour has completely different properties and tends to be very tender when you put it into different types of desserts. So we're not looking for that. We want the chew. So you're only going to get glutinous rice flour. Now, glutinous rice is an ingredient that goes by quite a few names. So glutinous rice, sweet rice, mochiko rice, and sticky rice are all kind of the same thing. There are some slight distinctions between each category depending on the length of the rice grain or where it originates. However, when you're cooking, they all kind of do the same thing, and that gives you a really sticky, chewy rice grain. Second thing you're gonna wanna get is black sesame powder. And I used to be a purist and only buy black sesame seeds, and then I would blend them and process them myself. But I've recently come around and decided that I prefer black sesame powder because when you buy black sesame seeds, there's a lot of variability to the quality of the seeds, and it's really hard to toast them without burning them. Even myself, who's been cooking for a really long time, like sometimes I just go a tiny bit over and the mixture ends up really bitter. So to me, it's not really worth it. And I find that powder gives you a pretty good flavor as is. So personally, I prefer black sesame powder. It also makes things a lot easier. You can find black sesame powder in an aisle that contains a lot of grains. Another thing you want to look out for is that you're not going to be buying a black sesame cereal or a black sesame soup. You want plain black sesame powder. So when in doubt, check the ingredients and make sure that the only ingredient listed is black sesame seeds or black sesame powder, and that's it. Next thing you want to look for is coconut oil. You can use different types of fats for this, but the main thing is that you need a fat that's solid at room temperature and melts at higher temperatures. And the reason for that is that we want kind of a lava liquidy filling. And so we want something that will be easy to handle when it's chilled, but will melt and give us a nice gooey, flowy texture once it's heated up. So we're back from the grocery store and we're ready to start. But first, here's a written list of all of the ingredients you'll need if you want to follow along. And the first thing that you're going to want to do is make the filling. So if it's been really cold out, your coconut oil probably looks like this and it's completely solid. So the first thing you want to do is melt it slightly. If it's in a glass jar, you can just microwave that directly. And the goal here is to not make the coconut oil super hot. So you just want to do 30 to 60 seconds to loosen it up. Then you'll add your melted coconut oil to a bowl, and don't pay too much attention to what my scale is reading here because I changed the ratio slightly when I wrote the recipe up. You'll also add your black sesame powder, and then you'll add your granulated sugar. And one thing I like to do is add a pretty big pinch of salt. I kind of like the salty sweet aspect of tangyuan, but you can add as much or as little as you want. I end up adding about 1/4 teaspoon. You'll mix that up with a flexible spatula, and this part's really important. So you want to look at the texture of your tangyuan when it's in this state. And if it's really firm, you can imagine that that's going to be the texture once your tangyuan are heated up on the stove. So what you actually want is kind of a flowy sort of lava texture. And if you're not achieving that, you can gradually add in about 1 teaspoon of coconut oil at a time until you get the right texture. Then you'll set that aside in the refrigerator. So the next thing you'll want to do is prep your ginger broth. And in order to do this, I like to start out with a knob of ginger about 3 to 5 inches in length. If you have the really shriveled up, wrinkly, sad ginger from a Western store, because that's all you could get your hands on, you'll probably want to use a little bit more. But if you don't like a really spicy ginger broth, you can use less. I have a little confession that I don't really like peeling ginger and I don't really care about it. I think that it's pretty cheap and it's okay if you waste a little bit of it. But if you do want to peel it with a spoon to conserve more of the ginger, you can definitely do that too. So once your ginger is nice and peeled, you'll want to slice it into some rounds about 1/4 or 1/8 of an inch thick. It's not that important because you're not actually going to eat the ginger. Then you'll dump all of your sliced ginger into a pot and you'll add some boiling water. After that, you'll want to get some rock sugar. There's different types at the Asian market, and today I'm using a yellow rock sugar, and I just found this huge chunk in the box and it seemed like the right amount, so I just dropped it in. This is really not an exact science. And you'll just put the lid on and let that simmer for at least an hour. And we'll go back to the filling, and once it's chilled, we'll want to start shaping it into balls. In this video, I ended up chilling my filling a little bit too long, so it was a little bit firmer than I would want it to be, but that's totally fine. In an ideal scenario, you'll kind of want the filling to have the texture of an unrefrigerated cookie dough, but if it's a little bit firmer, that's fine. You can just use your body heat by squeezing the filling in your hand until it warms up ever so slightly, and then you can roll it into a ball. Now, in this step, you want to be careful to not work the dough too much because it will end up melting in your hands. So just be careful that once you roll the ball, you put it down and leave it alone. You want your balls to be about a teaspoon in size, but it doesn't need to be exact. The smaller your filling ball is, the easier it's going to be to wrap, but the bigger it is, the more filling you'll have, and I really like filling. Once all of your balls are rolled, you can transfer this back to the fridge or even the freezer and let it chill. So like I mentioned, tangyuan wrappers are deceptively difficult, and I've heard from a lot of people that they've had trouble rolling out their dough. There's a big secret, and a lot of recipes online don't tell you to do this, and frankly, I'm not sure how they make it work. I'm sure there's a way, but this is a trick to make sure that your tangyuan is nice and easy to roll. We're going to use a mix of boiling water and room temperature water. The boiling water activates some of the starches in the glutinous rice flour and makes it nice and pliable. So that kind of squishy chewiness that you're probably familiar with from mochi, that's the texture that we want to start, but not get all the way there. We use room temperature water to just hydrate the rest of the flour and make it into basically a dough that has a Play-Doh texture. But ultimately the dough is just 2 ingredients. It's water and glutinous rice flour. So that kind of emphasizes how important it is to get the temperatures right and the ratios right. I've done a lot of testing, and this is the ratio that works the best. So the first thing you're going to do is add 120 grams of glutinous rice flour to a clean bowl, and then you're going to get out your kettle and freshly boil some water. And you do want to make sure that it's very, very freshly boiled, very hot, and be careful when you're pouring, of course. And you're going to add 40 grams of freshly boiled water to your glutinous rice flour. I find that a gooseneck kettle works really well here, but just work with whatever you have. Then you'll mix this with a whisk, and you'll see that the mixture is still very, very dry. It basically just looks like dry flour, but that's exactly what you want. Then you're gonna add in 50 grams of room temperature water, and this is how we're actually gonna hydrate the dough. So after you add the water, you'll start mixing it with a spatula, and you'll wanna make sure that you scrape off the spatula every now and then because a lot of the wet dough will collect around the spatula, and that's sort of valuable water that you wanna use in the dough. If you've ever made pie dough before, you'll see that the texture kind of resembles a shaggy pie dough, and that's exactly the texture that you want to achieve before you start to actually knead the dough with your hands. As you squish it and push it around, it'll start out feeling probably a little bit too dry, but just trust the process here, keep kneading it and going along with it, and you can always troubleshoot later on. If there are any little bits of dry flour in the bowl, you'll want to make sure that you use your dough ball to kind of pick those up and just keep doing that process. Then we'll move into what I call my patented tangyuan technique. I don't think this is a formal technique. I just kind of started doing this and it ended up working really well. And what you'll do is basically just roll the dough between your palms, and then as it kind of lengthens, you'll fold it. And what's really nice about this is it does two things. It mixes the dough really nicely, and as you fold it, it gives you a way to check the texture of the dough and make sure that it's behaving properly. So what we want to see is a dough that's really soft, smooth, pliable. It doesn't crack when it's folded, and it doesn't break like chalk. And if you're confused about that, I have a demonstration of what that means later on in the troubleshooting section of this video. So this is a perfect ball of dough, and what we're gonna do now is add some natural food coloring. In this case, I'm using butterfly pea flour powder to make it blue. So all I have to do is grab some of the powder up in my dough, and then I'm gonna keep going on with that rolling and folding process. It's gonna take a little bit of time and elbow grease, but eventually all of the color will be distributed evenly throughout the dough, and you don't want any streaks here unless that's kind of the look you're going for. I personally like to use natural food colorings, but you definitely can use regular food coloring as well. I'm gonna throw up a list of the natural food dyes that I use, but again, whatever works. And once you get the right texture, you'll wanna make sure that you immediately wrap up your dough in plastic or a plastic bag to make sure that it doesn't lose any moisture. So what happens if your dough isn't quite looking the way that it looks in this video? How do you troubleshoot and fix your problems? In the first scenario, if you're rolling your dough and it's feeling a little bit dry, and as you go to bend it into a U shape, it kind of breaks like chalk, that is a really bad sign. That basically means that the water that you used was not hot enough, and so the dough didn't cook. And unfortunately, you can't really fix this, so I would just start over. In this second scenario, if we're rolling out the dough between our hands and we see that it's leaving some sticky residue on our palms, that means it's too wet. So we'll add a teaspoon of glutinous rice flour at a time and continue to knead the dough, and it should fix itself. Just make sure to not add too much glutinous rice flour at a time, because otherwise you might end up with a dough that's too dry and have the opposite problem. And finally, in scenario 3, if your dough is looking a little dry, and as you go to roll it and squeeze it and bend it, it doesn't quite break like chalk, but it just has cracks show up, that means that the water probably was hot enough, which is a good thing, but that you don't have enough water in the dough overall. So what you'll do is get your hands just ever so slightly wet, and you'll keep doing the rolling and folding process. And I find that hydrating this dough takes a little bit of time, but you wanna go slowly, because again, you don't wanna end up with a dough that's too wet. The next step is shaping and stuffing your tangyuan. So if we're making a plain white or plain solid colored tangyuan, the first thing we're gonna do is grab a ball of dough about the size of a ping pong ball or slightly smaller. And we're gonna roll that into a perfectly smooth ball, and then pinch that with our fingers into a little pancake shape. Then we're gonna get one of our very well chilled filling balls. It should be very firm. And you'll place that filling ball in the middle of your little pancake, and then squish the dough up around the edges of the filling ball, making sure to squeeze out any potential air pockets, because that can lead to your tangyuan cracking while you're cooking it. The main goal when you're shaping tangyuan is to create a ball that's not going to crack when you start boiling it. So you want to make sure your tangyuan is nice and smooth with no cracks or dimples, and you can use a little bit of water in your hands to smooth it out. Once you're done rolling your ball, just stop, because if you work it for too long, the filling will start to melt and it'll become hard to work with. Then you'll put it aside and make sure that you wrap it so it doesn't dry out. Now, if you want to make really over-the-top tangyuan like I do, here's how you do it. So first I'm going to show you how you make a flour. And this process involves rolling very, very tiny balls of dough into what are going to become the petals. So I usually like to make 5 petals, and I kind of push them together into a flower shape. And then I take a bigger piece of dough, and this is going to be like the bulk of the wrapper. And I do the same process that I did for my plain tangyuan, but now I'm going to squish it on top of the flour. Tangyuan dough is really nice because it kind of sticks to itself, so you don't really need to do anything to make it stick. Just make sure you apply a little bit of pressure. Then I wrap up my tangyuan ball, make it nice and smooth, and I like to add a little dot for the filling after the fact. So now we have our little flower. The second thing I'm going to show you is how to make stripes. So I like to roll little snakes of dough, and you need very little dough to do this. So in this case, I used blue and yellow, and then I kind of wanted to do like an interesting geometric thing, so I made some stripes of green and blue also. And I kind of trimmed off the edge of each of these little arrangements and then stuck them together. And it didn't work super well, but it did kind of work. So you can get really creative here. You can do whatever you want. You can make them just simple stripes as well. And you're gonna wrap that around the filling. Now, in this example, you can see a lot of the filling is still exposed. So what we can do is just get an extra piece of solid colored dough and just wrap that around and kind of squish all of the edges together so that there are no cracks. And that's it. So as long as the filling is cold, these are really easy to repair, but once your filling starts to melt, you're kind of out of luck and you might need to start over. In this example, I'm showing how to make kind of a marbled texture, and you can do this however you want, but I like to kind of stack the colors and then slice them and then sandwich them together. And again, we just want to make sure that the ball is completely closed. One other thing I like to do is make smaller solid colored balls of dough just as kind of accessories to the main tangyuan, so you can do that too. And finally, I've been seeing these persimmon tangyuan that you can get at the store all over the place, so I decided to show you how you can make them yourself. I didn't make orange, but I used blue, so it's kind of like a little blueberry or something. So I just rolled a normal solid blue ball, and then I got some green and made the top of the blueberry. So I just pinched and flattened the shape with my hands. There are definitely more kind of neat and technical ways to do this, but do whatever you want. To cook your tangyuan, you want to put them in a pot of boiling water, and you want to make sure that it's really hot and actually boiling, because as you add your tangyuan, the water will stop boiling. So you want to make sure it's hot enough. You can kind of push them around a little bit with a spoon very gently to make sure they're not sticking to the bottom or to each other. And what's nice is that you'll know your tangyuan are done once they start to float to the top of the water. I like to give them another 30 to 60 seconds once they're floating, just to make sure that the filling is going to have a nice lava texture. Then I strain and scoop out my tangyuan and put them into a bowl. And at this point, your ginger broth should be done, and it should be nice and spicy. Again, if you don't want it as spicy, you don't have to add as much ginger. And if it's not sweet enough, you can add more sugar. And if it's too sweet, you can add more water. Usually people eat about 3 tangyuan at a time, and no more than that because they're a little bit rich. Now, when you break into a tangyuan, they should have this nice, flowy black sesame texture inside. And you can see how our flour turned out. It's very cute. This is one of my favorite color combinations that I've done so far. The striped one that I made, I think cracked ever so slightly. You can see how thin the texture was, and it made it susceptible to cracking. But I really liked how this kind of marbled stripey one came out. Our little blueberry is also very cute, so you can see how you can make a persimmon. It's exactly the same thing, but with orange dough. And I think there's so many possibilities for tangyuan once you learn how to make these simple shapes and patterns. The world is kind of your oyster, and you can kind of make whatever you want. At some of our workshops, I've seen people make some of the cutest and weirdest designs I've ever seen. So I hope that you get creative with it.
Spicy.
One more thing I get a lot of questions about is the timeline behind making tangyuan and whether you can make them ahead of time. And I have some unfortunate answers for you, and I don't think it's what you want to hear, but tangyuan don't keep well. So this is usually what I like to do. The day before I plan on cooking and eating the tangyuan, I'll make the filling, and I'll let the filling rest in the fridge, and then I'll roll it into balls, and then I'll either put it back into the fridge or I'll freeze it. Obviously, if you freeze them in an airtight container, they'll last for a long time and you can make tangyuan down the road. But when it comes to the dough, I make the dough the morning of when I plan to cook and eat the tangyuan. And I don't make it before that because the dough doesn't keep well. So because the dough is only 2 ingredients, it's super sensitive to moisture. And the longer that you let it sit out, even if it's wrapped up in plastic, the more prone it is to cracking. Once the balls are assembled and rolled, they're also really prone to cracking. So I like to try to cook them within about an hour, maybe 2 hours of making them. And any longer than that, you can experiment with freezing, but I've seen the same issues happen with freezing where the balls will crack. One other thing is that if you make the dough a little bit thicker in your tangyuan ball, you'll probably have a higher likelihood of that ball surviving being frozen, but again, it's kind of a toss-up. So I think I've covered pretty much all of the basics when it comes to making tangyuan at home. I didn't end up going into the other types of fillings that you can make, but if you want to see a video on how I make peanut tangyuan and other flavors, let me know and I can make a separate video with those recipes. Make sure that you like and subscribe to my channel so I can make more recipe videos like this one. And I hope that you all have a really great Lunar New Year filled with friends and family, or whatever holiday you might be celebrating. And I will see you guys next time.